Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to moderate that panel. Topic is the liberal world order at risk? It's a rather ambitious endeavor to discuss this topic in 30 or 40 minutes. It's an incredibly wide-ranging topic of global dimension, and I think the challenge will be here to reduce complexity. Reduktion von Komplexität. Niklas Luhmann, a sociologist, is the author of that motto. But we have a wonderful panel here who will help us to understand that challenge and also enlighten us about the world, the liberal world order. And I start to introduce the panelists. To my right is Raji Jayaraman. She is a professor at the European School of Management and Technology in Berlin, and at the same time also a professor at the University of Toronto, and she also heads a Center for Sustainable Transformation. I further introduce Dr. Stefan Oschmann, a long-term CEO of a global company, Merck, and now investor and partner of technology ventures. And to my left is Professor Moritz Schularick. Needs no introduction. We have heard and seen him in action. And also Professor Mathias Risse, Professor of Human Rights, Global Affairs and Philosophy. What a range of subjects at the Harvard Kennedy School. I will take a minute or two to frame a little bit our topic. I think it's a truism that we live in an almost unprecedented, tumultuous time, also globally. Our so-called liberal global order is under stress. Sometimes it's called the rules-based international order, and it's sort of grounded, at least for those who are proponents of that order, it's grounded in a set of ideas of democracy, rule of law, individual human and civil rights, the open and free economic order, and the respect for international law. And some of us might have thought that this concept of a global liberal order would spread incrementally to the rest of the world, and it quite frankly didn't happen. And it's, more than that, it's been currently really challenged by some factors, and we want to find out what those factors are. Some indices even indicate that there is a retreat of democracy worldwide. For instance, the Freedom House and NGO, also the Economist Democracy Index, they indicate retreat of democracies and rise of authoritarian regimes. Now, where are those challenges? Where do they come from? Is it Russia that has been blatantly attacking and invading Ukraine and is threatening the European order? Is it China, which is vying for global influence, and it is cause of coming up with an alternative global order? Is it the so-called global South, major countries in the developing world that are sort of not following anymore the lead of the United States as the protagonist, as the leader of that liberal order? Or is it even the US itself, where challenges emanate from, maybe with a look at what it's coming up at the elections in 2024. So the question at stake here is, will democracies and the liberal order be resilient enough to stand up to these challenges? And how should we address them? And is there or is there a different kind of order where the future lies? Now, let me start with you, Raji. And we tend to think in the West, or in the West and in the areas where our partners and allies are, we tend to think that our understanding of the liberal world order should be followed by everybody, and help us to understand how important countries in the developing world, in the global south, like India, where you come from, how they are perceiving this claim.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Is this on? Excellent. Thanks for the question, Peter. So the Western liberal order, when people ask me that question, I'm reminded of this apocryphal incident when Gandhi was in the UK negotiating Indian independence. The story is that he got off the boat. Some journalist rushed up to him and said, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think about, British civilization? And he said, I think it would be a very good idea. And let me try and channel my inner Mr. Gandhi for a moment in answer to your question, which is that I think I'm not sure that the Western liberal order, the way I imagine many of us in the audience, myself included, conceive of it, was ever really. I don't think everyone bought the idea to begin with, and I think that lies in the Indian context in two realms. One is the double standard, and the second is the hypocrisy. And I'm just going to put this out there. I'm not saying these are necessarily my views. And it helps, I think, maybe to break down this Western liberal order into two of the things that you mentioned, Peter. One is political liberalism, and the second is economic liberalism. So let's start in the Indian context with the political liberalism. India, from the very first day, I don't know if you guys have ever heard or read Nehru's speech at midnight. It's called The Tryst with Destiny. It's a beautiful speech. And in that speech, Nehru talks about India's tryst with destiny. And it was decided from the very beginning India was going to be a democracy. And India, I'll get to some challenges in a second, but India is a democracy. Okay, it is the world's, not the oldest, but the largest democracy to this day. So now ask yourself, if you're Indian, what good has that done us, honestly? Okay, so following independence, two things happened in August 1947. One is India got its independence. The second is partition. Okay, we can talk about partition later, but it was a traumatic event for everyone involved. We had Pakistan, so literally our twin, same continent, same people, basically. Pakistan chose the path of dictatorship. India chose the path of democracy. Guess who was supported during the Cold War? Okay, India was a non-aligned nation. India was largely forgotten. Pakistan was put at the forefront. Then you say to yourself, as an Indian, all right, like, seriously, dude? Like, we've chosen this difficult path, and Pakistan, really? Fast forward 50 years, okay? We're still loyally on this path, this democratic path. Pakistan, no one really, Pakistan is no longer India's arch enemy. No one, Indians don't take Pakistan very seriously. Who is the arch enemy? It's China. Again, like a whole lot of good, the whole democratic, Western liberal democracy agenda has done Indians. So on that front, we're saying, you're hypocrites. The double standards part, let's move then to the economic liberalism. Okay, India, unlike its marriage to democracy, was not married to the liberal market economy upon independence. All right, India chose largely due to the Congress Party that ruled India at the time. I should mention, by the way, I'm an economist. I'm not a historian, so all of this that I'm saying is just casual reading. Don't quote me on any of this. So India chose the path of Fabian socialism. All right, this is Nehru's education in Oxbridge, whatever. So this was, from the beginning, we're on 5-year plans, all right? Very much, not quite command and control. There's some elements of the market there, but very much in a sort of socialist bent, following independence. At some stage, not because we said, oh gosh, markets are such a great idea. No, it's just that, there was a balance of payments crisis. I'm an economist, so I know a little bit about that. Balance of payments crisis, we can't pay our bills, and then we had to turn to the market. We had to open up. It's gone pretty well for us so far, right? But then you always have like the IMF, the World Bank, the EU, all the rest of these people breathing down your necks and saying, oh, but you have protectionism, oh, but you have subsidies. And this is not just true of India, right? This is true of every country in the global south that has the IMF breathing down their necks. And then you think, okay, all right, bad. We're going to have our wrists slapped again. Let's open up. And then you get things like the COVID crisis hitting the world. And where does the fiscal responsibility go suddenly during the COVID crisis, all right? I mean, you're spending right, left, and center. And so, there's the hypocrisy in terms of the political liberalism, and then there's the incredible, in Indians, many Indians view, there's an incredible double standard when it comes to the economic liberalism, all right? This is not a great sell so far in terms of the, Western liberal ideal. Let me conclude with just one thing. India, as I said at the very beginning, is, I really believe, a convinced democratic country. That now I do think is in peril, because in India, the fourth rail of democracy, which is freedom of the press, that's almost gone, all right? It's almost entirely gone in the Indian context. Sadly, I don't think, I'm going to say you guys sitting here, I don't think there's anything you can do about it, because you've lost all credibility. Sorry, I'm making this personal. I don't mean to make it personal. But the Western world has lost all credibility in that sense. The question is what to do. I don't have an answer to that. But let me stop there.
Raji, can I follow up? Apparently, then there is also a kind of crisis of democracy looming in India. Now, India has become, if you will, a rising geopolitical star in the geopolitical landscape. Are we seeing, when you look at other countries, emerging countries, developing countries like Brazil, like the Gulf countries, South Africa, are we witnessing a moment of the rise of the rest? The rest meaning not in the camp of the West, neither in the camp of Russia and China. Is that the moment of the rise of the West? Are we at that juncture?
I'm not a political scientist, but I'm going to hazard a guess. And I would say, in general, the answer is yes, if for no other reason that demographics is working against the Western world. All right, that's just where all the people live, and that's going to be where the demand is, and that's going to be the source of supply. So just from an economic perspective, I'd say absolutely, and it's inevitable. So one has to find a way of building a constructive relationship with these other countries.
Yeah. Stefan.
Stefan is me.
Stefan, sorry. I wanted Mathias. Getting confused here. Mathias, sorry. You are an expert. You live in the US. You hail from Germany. So let me quiz you on the United States. It used to be the kind of standard bearer of that concept of the global liberal order. Is there a risk that will change maybe next year?
Well, yeah, there's a very considerable risk that will change. Let me maybe just put the American role in this whole story a little bit in context, also by way of illuminating why what we call the liberal order really is very much an American construction to begin with, and why now the elections next year in the United States really should be on the very top of the list of challenges to that order. So if we think back to the beginnings of that order, so in the 1930s, it was mentioned before, we get the New Deal under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which was a massive program of administrative reform with an eye on questions of fairness and social justice, in addition to questions of stability. It's then when we're getting things like Social Security hadn't existed before. So the American government gets this massive boost and becomes a completely different kind of beast than it had been before. Second World War happens, the United States fights in Europe, fights in Asia, the United States gains a completely different self-understanding. To this day, we call these people the greatest generation for for their labors. And then at the end of the war, coming out of the war, we are getting something that is really a projection of the American New Deal onto the global stage, and that is the United Nations and the United Nations system. Obviously, there's a complex agency here, and also within the United States, there was a complexity of agency to this, but basically that is what this is, right? Taking the New Deal and projecting it into the global stage. And the United Nations, as we have them coming out of the 40s into the 50s, is a hotbed of absolutely fascinating ideas about what is doable at the global stage. And some people say this really should be a global welfare state, so that's kind of one extreme version of that. But it's important to understand, so that this is what we think as the liberal order, but it's never really a unitary thing from the beginning on, right? So it has this core, the UN system. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is added in 48, turns 75 this year. But then there's also a lot of exclusion happening, and there's a lot of conflict happening. So one thing we are not getting as part of the global system is a trade organization, right? So this is envisaged as part of the Bretton Woods institution. So we get the World Bank, we get the IMF as part of the UN system. We are not getting the International Trade Organization, which was actually seen by the countries in the process of decolonization as their major entry point into a new kind of world, right? That does not happen. Instead, trade is managed by the word club often comes up in the trade domain, right? It's managed by a kind of club system that excludes basically all of these emerging countries. And of course, we are falling into the Cold War then. So even though the Soviet Union, which of course also won the war, right, against the Nazis at enormous cost, so the Soviet Union and the United States falling into the Cold War. So it's never, there is an American world being created, Pax Americana, we often talk about. And for the Americans, this is partly a projection of values. It's also, a self-interest thing. It makes the world safe for American products. And then fast forward, with all this lack of unitary structure, with all the conflicts, eventually the Soviet Union collapses, and we are coming into the 1990s. We're coming into the stage of hyperglobalization, and the United States is kind of doing something that people are not really quite aware is happening at the time. So Clinton is president. The United States is opening up itself massively. So globalization, outsourcing is happening, but they're not really doing, so the Democratic Party is not very foresighted about this. The Democratic Party doesn't do a systematic industrial policy. It doesn't do a systematic social policy. They just kind of assume trickle-down effects from globalization will take care of everything, like Kaldor-Hicks efficiency will kick in, and that just doesn't happen, right? So fast forward again, so now we have Trump. Next year, Trump might come back, and basically what Trump is capitalizing on is an accumulated frustration from this lack of concern with the working classes in the United States coming out of the Democratic administration, and is now capitalizing on that, on an attitude among large parts of the American population to say, getting involved with the rest of the globe, building a global order hasn't really worked out for us. We working class people haven't benefited from that. And so we are also not interested in what they perceive as providing protection for the rest of the world, right? And so Trump is massively capitalizing on that now, and we can talk about that maybe later. But if you think about what might be happen 2024, also developments in AI revolutionize campaigning as we speak. But there is a very distinct danger that the anti-global order, anti-liberal order group around Trump will now come back much better prepared than they have been before, and bring into the world a very different understanding of international politics, and also that reflected in a very different understanding of domestic politics. So the removal of what they like to call the deep state. So that's and that I think that happens. Kind of thinking of and thereby really transforming global politics into a more chaotic system, while removing the bureaucratic competent class in the United States domestically, really could create a very different world from what we have had.
Mathias, let me follow up a question. Do you think in the event of a Trump victory or a victory of another Republican candidate, will the tradition of isolationism re-emerge? Because if we look at the history of the United States foreign policy, and I'm speaking here under the control of Professor Leonhard, whether this is correct or not, it is almost has been an exception in American history to be engaged in Europe in a way that it did with this huge investment after 1945. It's an exception to the rule. Now, would that be a possibility that sort of isolationist forces reemerge, and that of course would change the game for us in Europe here?
Yeah. So we call the 20th century the American century, right? And there's really, whatever one's skepticism about the United States may be, this is amply justified through its involvement in the First World War, the Second World War, the institution building, all of that. And really in the 30s, when the New Deal happened, there was a massive crisis around the future of democracy. Fascism was doing well by certain standards. Communism was doing well by certain standards. So the Americans really did great things. And so what we have seen in recent times now, so of course, if you talk isolationism versus interventionism, it's not like there's always like it's either this or that, right? So we already see a lot of isolationism happening right now. So if you look at what Biden is doing, so Biden, as opposed to Clinton, is having a very intense industrial policy, right? So the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and things like that, right? This is an intervention in industrial policy of the magnitude of that is just astounding, right? But it's very America focused. So this idea of America first, Biden doesn't talk like that, but in terms of the industrial policy, it is very much doing that. So it's a turning away from internationalization in that domain. Biden is not doing much to revitalize international institutions that have suffered under Trump. So he's not reactivating the World Trade Organization, for example. The one thing that he is very committed to is the security arrangement, the North Atlantic security arrangement, so the commitment to Ukraine in particular. But you see, it has these different dimensions, right? So we already have a lot of isolationism in place. And the big thing that might change then next year, and that lineup of factors, is a withdrawal from the Ukraine conflict.
Thank you. Now to you, Moritz. I want to ask you about China as a challenger to that global liberal order. China is much more assertive in recent years, and I think it's positioning itself as the other superpower. Xi Jinping himself has said in the year 2049, China will become and wants to become and will become the superpower number one. So that's a clear goal. Now, in the German context, there has been a lot of discussion recently about an overdependence on China and interconnectiveness that is dangerous. In cases of, Ernstfall, Taiwan. How do you see, we've seen a China strategy now emanating from the federal government. How do you see that discussion evolving? Are we in a phase of history where China poses a challenge economically and politically to our liberal world order?
Excellent question. I think the answer is yes, but let me maybe take a step back. It was in 2000, I think 2007, Neil Ferguson and I wrote a little article called about Chimerica. And we've kind of invented this term Chimerica. We talked about the symbiosis of these two, the very close trade connections and financial connections. And I think fast forwarding, I take that from you, fast forwarding 15 years now, we are still in a world that is where Chimerica, where China and the US are dominating the outlook for the international liberal order that we're talking about. And I think the two of them are the single, I mean, not to the same degree, so don't get me wrong, but I think the selective multilateralism that the US is practicing now, that is basically ignoring the World Trade Organization, doing its own thing with the IRA, being very selective about the international engagements that the US is still willing to take. And of course, what China is doing on its way to become superpower number one, number two, or like at least be up there with the United States through its Belt and Road Initiative, through the a massive financial engagement in Africa that's undermining multilateral efforts for debt rescheduling and financial support to Africa. I think these two countries will determine the fate of the rules-based international order, and I'm not very optimistic. I think so. This rule we will have to adjust and think about an international economic order that is less rules-based and much more geopolitical and geoeconomic. In terms of the importance of China to Europe and especially the German economy, I mean, some figures would be maybe that's a good start. So our trade both on the import and export side is roughly 9-10% of total trade is with China. If you compare that to Russia, Russia was 2-3%, so China is roughly three times more important than Russia. But I think the important additional insight is that our trade with China is much more diversified than we were dependent on Russia for one commodity. That was almost all our dependence on the import side. Our trade with China has we can substitute, we can go to other countries, we can divert that trade. So I think in our minds, our dependence on China is much bigger than it is on the ground and is in reality. This being said, there are very specific cases, vocal cases, and it kind of brings me a little bit back to what I said at the beginning of individual companies that have made very, very large bets on China. If these bets go wrong, that's a problem for the shareholders of these companies because a lot of the profits that came from the local production, the local sales in China will no longer come. That will make us poor as a country, but through the mainly because of the shareholders don't get these dividends anymore. So those players will be very vocal. They already have been very vocal, but again, from an aggregate perspective, I don't think our dependence on China is such that we need to sort of preemptively shortcut our maneuverability in terms of foreign policy, foreign economic policy. And I think there's much option value in saying self-confidently, we're strong, we're not so dependent on you, because that actually might make also a conflict less likely.
Also a follow-up question, as sometimes I think some NGOs believe that we have leverage against China, and sometimes also think parts of the federal government think we have leverage. Now, do you think we do have leverage when we sort of articulate human rights issues, or if we sort of decouple, or we don't want to be decoupling, but when we are de-risking and diversifying, do you think that really makes a difference in Chinese eyes?
I do think that China is there's a dependence of China on European technology, on European on imports from Europe, especially capital goods, and that is something that we can leverage. But I don't think that for these sort of first order geopolitical questions, these dependencies will enter massively into sort of the minds of Chinese policymakers. I think there is value. I don't see, let me put it this way, I don't see any value from the European or German perspective right now in talking up our dependency on China. I don't see any strategic value in that. I don't think it's real. I think it will be economic cost. It will be, but it will be something. We've just had the Russia sort of decoupling, de-risking, or sort of decoupling from China will be painful, but it will be manageable as well. And right now, sort of preempting that by saying we're so dependent, we would never do anything if you invade Taiwan, I don't think that's a very sensible strategy.
Mm. Yeah, well, a little bit of an unorthodox voice, and I welcome that. Stefan, you are a very, very experienced business leader who has worked in many parts of the world. You are a truly global business leader. Let me ask you, how, in your view, do the geopolitical tensions, the new configuration, the great power rivalry, if you will, how does impact on the global international economic order? What will be the economic world in 5, 10 years, 15 years for businesses?
I'm not a historian. I'm not an economist, and I'm not a lawyer, and I definitely don't have a crystal ball, and I will not make an attempt to make any forecast about what's going to happen in 10 years from now. But maybe a couple of thoughts in framing why a liberal order is so important for mankind. I assume there was never really a liberal order in existence apart from maybe from 1991 until 2001.
Yeah.
So, if we go back in year 400, much of the world's GDP was focused on the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire collapsed through various factors. One of it was the fundamentalist rule of the Catholic Church and the emergence of feudalistic societies. And Europe was, from a world economic point of view, a non-entity up until about the 14th century. In the 14th century, world GDP, if you look at India and China, 80% of world GDP was in India and in China. So India, the global south, had a big head start, actually. Yeah? Europe was nowhere. Why did Europe change? It changed in smaller communities, in states like in Tuscany, like in Venice, when banking systems emerged, and what we call capitalism or the market economy developed. It happened in the Netherlands, it happened in the UK, it happened in quite a few places. In Germany, it happened in individual cities like in Hamburg. And whenever you had a more liberal system, i.e. a system that was less focused on central power and more focused on broader participation, you had economic success. And you had a lot of technology development in Europe, in shipbuilding, in arms, in communication technology, etc. So I don't think we should take these things for granted. And I don't think we should spend much of our time self-flagellating. We should look forward. How can we in this world continue to strive for the common good? I remember I was once at the World Economic Forum many times, but I once met the then head of the United Nations Environment Program, a left-leaning Norwegian socialist, who gave a speech, and he said, what shapes the world? His view was what shapes the world. He said it's on the one hand, the universal drive among people for justice, for freedom, and for social cohesion. And on the other hand, it is science and it is responsible entrepreneurship. And this is sort of my personal credo, why I think a liberal order is useful and why a liberal order is also the right approach to solving the current problems that we have. If you looked at geopolitics in boardrooms 20 years ago, it was basically non-existent. You know, Wolfgang Ischinger, our friend, wouldn't have had much of a business giving presentations to board of directors about geopolitics, because geopolitics largely didn't matter for business. Nowadays, it's completely different. Geopolitics is very much is very much at the center, and large corporations need to define, can we continue to work on a fully globalized scale? And many companies decide they can't. For instance, if you're, we had a lot of discussion today and yesterday also about the semiconductor industry. If you're in the semiconductor industry, you must decide, do I work with the Chinese or do I work with the Americans? It is not possible to be at the cutting edge of semiconductor development and work with both systems. There are different industries that are in differently challenging situations, but geopolitics does matter, and business leaders need to be cognizant of geopolitical trends and need to understand these big socioeconomic trends in order to take the right decisions.
I think we have exhausted our, if not you, then our time budget. I just want to share with you the 2 or 3 takeaways that I personally take from this discussion. Number one is probably us as Europeans, we should stop dreaming of one liberal global order. It might not happen. And as Stefan said, I think it was only close to being realized 2 or 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, and that period is now over. My second takeaway is that the future world will probably be more than ever shaped by the 2 superpowers, USA and China, and they will be probably competing with different concepts of a world order, and maybe what you call the selective multilateralism will be a model that we will be witnessing in the future, and hopefully the climate issue will be part of lateral process, and hopefully we can preserve a partnership with countries like China on that issue, although we compete and sometimes are also rivals in other areas. And I think the takeaway is probably is the micro still? We've got to open up more to the concerns of what is called the global south, and we have to stop a bit to impose our Western templates on those countries if we want to be them part of our common order. I think here we need to move away sometimes a little from our Eurocentric world war. Well, those are the 3 world view, not world war. I just shared with you my own takeaways, and I thank the panelists and you for your attention.
Thank you.